Seems like the winter weather has turned a little rainy on us. But that's okay. We've got a warm fire and lots of great stories. Welcome to Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. Let's get started with some of my all-time favorite stories that I hope are some of yours. It's weird being a person in a foreign land. You don't really speak the language sometimes. You don't know the people. You don't often know the customs and how to avoid certain local legends. But let's hope that if you decide to travel abroad, you don't run afoul of the Sheela. Have you ever met someone who changed your life so completely? Someone who's your first, your last, your only? I met her once. Her name was Sheela. I worked as an engineer in China. My company hired me straight out of college and offered me a substantial sign-on bonus if I would relocate to the mainland hub. Apparently, the company was responsible for many of the dams across China, and due to poor upkeep, many of the lawsuits leveled against them had been for machinery failure. My job was to check the machinery in the dams and make sure they were working correctly. It's a pretty lucrative job. After a few years, I find myself nearly fluent in the regional dialect. An American is something of a novelty for the people in these rural towns. I often find myself invited to bars or back to someone's house at the end of the day. The women have been very amicable, if not right out flirtatious. I usually don't find it difficult to find female companionship if I want it. Well, I didn't, at least. That was before I met Sheela, though. I was checking on a rather large dam near the coast, one that filters the often polluted river water and keeps debris from reaching the ocean. The dam's been leaking something caustic into the sea for a few months, and it was my job to figure out why it was doing that. I won't bore you with the technical details, but it wasn't hard to figure out what was going on. No one had bothered to dump the holding tanks that collect the pollutants, and they were leaking out into the dam walls and then into the ocean. No one had bothered to tell the workers to dump the tanks either. So a week of work and one pumper barge later, the dam was back up and keeping the ocean clean. That was apparently cause for celebration. The dam workers took me out for a few drinks that night. The local community, heavily centered around the fishing industry, wanted to meet me and thank me. A celebration was held, and I was introduced to everyone from the village mayor to the town priest. The mood was definitely festive, and I remember being handed a small cup of strong liquor early in. The clear liquor was quite potent, and after a while, the night became a jumble of colors and sounds. I danced and laughed and ate some of the best food I'd ever tasted. The whole village was so friendly that, after a while, I forgot to be self-conscious about my height or my nationality and just let myself be immersed in the moment. I was sitting under an overhang, a fourth cup of the strong liquor at hand, when I saw a goddess approach me. Her hair was pale, not blonde, but white, and her dress was seafoam green and clung to her. She had the eye of every man there, and had the ire of every woman. I remember thinking that she didn't seem to fit the standards of this place. She was tall, almost as tall as me, and her skin was darker, tanned, brown. She looked foreign, vaguely Middle Eastern, and I remembered thinking that she looked like no one I'd ever seen before. She sauntered up to me, her eyes promising things her body was more than capable of keeping, and extended a hand to me. "Dance?" she asked, her voice gliding out like a midnight tide. I reached out, shakily, and took her hand. She pulled me up, not easy to do, considering I'm mostly muscle and 6'2". As the music started, she began to spin me and pull me in time with her own internal beat. We moved as galaxies moved, a solar system unto ourself, and when I looked at her, I could see her barely contained longing. She desired me. She wanted me. And when she pulled me close, I could feel her heart racing in her chest. Her breasts pressed against me through the dress, and her lips slid up my neck. I heard her whisper something in my ear that sent pins down my spine. "Come with me. Come with Sheela." She broke from me then, a teasing finger tempting me away from the dancers. I stumbled after her, the drink and the fire in my nethers piloting me easily. Did you say Sheela? Is that your name?" I slurred, letting her lead me towards the beach. She smiled and kept crooking her finger at me as we left the festivities. She led me through the sprawl of the little dwellings that butted up against the sea, and in my drunken state I was in no mood to think about what I might be doing. Her pale hair danced in the moonlight, and her tan skin shone so pale it was almost white. It turned her into a ghost, floating along before me as I stumbled on the rutted path. She beckoned me onward, and as I came, I could hear some exotic melody floating around us in the air. Then the dog began to bark, and the melody was snatched away. He wasn't much of a guard dog, some little mutt that had been tied up in someone's yard, but the effect he had on her was jarring. She recoiled as though she had been burned, and took a few shaky steps away from the animal. The dog was lunging at her, straining against its rope, and snarling like a wild thing. He was choking himself trying to get free, and his aggressive behavior seemed aimed solely at my companion. Watching him maul the air was starting to bring me out of my daze. Then Sheela rounded on him, and hissing at him like a scalded cat. The dog yarked and backpedaled to hunker under the porch, completely chastised. When she crooked her finger at me, the lovely music began to take me away again. We came to the beach, and she led me to a spot behind a stand of vegetation. There sat a hand-carved wooden boat bobbing in the surf. As I climbed inside, I felt the weight of the drink descend on me. I closed my eyes and felt the boat slip off into the waves. My fingers splashed into the spray when they took to the water, and I remember thinking that we were moving much too fast for a boat she was paddling. I'd seen no motor, and the boat looked like the kind that you would need big oars and strong arms to pilot. As we bobbed and floated in the churning soup, I let my mind focus on the strange music enveloping me, and drifted off for what couldn't have been longer than a few minutes. When I awoke, we were on a very different stretch of sand, and her hands were pressed against my chest, her face very close to mine. She smiled when she saw that I was awake. "Come," she whispered, and was off me and out of the boat with a cat-like grace. I rose from the boat much less gracefully, and as I looked across the water, I could see the lights of the little fishing village many miles away. I looked for the oars, but I didn't see them. I must have been out for hours, because there was no way she could have gone that far in a few minutes. The little boat bobbed in the shallows, having no anchor and no means to stay put either, and that confused me as well. Surely the tide must take it back out again without something to tie it down. Then the warm laughter of my guide and the soft music enveloped me again, and I followed her into the woods. A lush jungle lay not far from the boat, and she was standing at the edge and looking lovely in her green dress. She moved into the tree line, begging to be chased, and in the light of the moon, I dogged her steps as my drink-soaked brain processed only the need to have her. The jungle vegetation was lush and thick. On any other night, I would have been hesitant to plunge into there for fear of snakes or poisonous insects. That night, though, I blundered in with wild abandon, and the deeper I went, the deeper I was pushed to go. When I crashed into a small clearing, a burbling pool splishing placidly, I looked around wildly. She was nowhere to be seen, but I could still hear the music, and I knew she couldn't be far. Suddenly, the burbling became a loud expulsion of water, and she rose from the water like a nymph. I must have looked ghastly myself, one shoe missing, clothes torn and tattered from my wild run, and my face awash with mud and sweat. She approached me, however, as though I were some Greek god. She slid her soft hands over my cheek and pressed her cool lips against mine. She tasted exotic, like oils and spices and something unknown. She tasted like the grave, but I wouldn't know that until later. She broke our kiss and slid her mouth to my ear as she whispered her last request. "Dance for me." I felt my limbs go taut, like a puppet whose strings have been pulled, and suddenly I broke into a wild and frantic sort of dancing. The music in my head changed, becoming primal and dissident. My body threw itself wildly about. My throat erupted in earthy screams of ecstasy. I felt like one of those ravers in a mosh pit as my body danced out its primal need for her. She sat back against a rock, her dress hiking up to show me a pale leg that I was sure had been tanned earlier. Hadn't she looked exotic before? Vaguely Middle Eastern? Now her skin was pale as cream, and her white hair seemed brittle and corpsey as the moon spilled across it. Her dress suddenly seemed more like a funeral shift, and the green became mold as her cat-like eyes stared at me in the throes of my passionate dancing. I was a beast, a man on fire, and as I danced, I felt my limbs exerting themselves to the limits. My legs gave way first, spilling me head first onto the dirt. I rolled over, my arms still trying to dance, and I saw her creep forward like something from a horror movie. She scuttled ghoulishly, on all fours, and my limbs refused to heed any of the commands I was giving them. My legs twitched, trying to dance, but unable, and my arms kept thrashing and hitching feebly as she approached. I could see her staring at me from the soles of my feet as she peeked at me from between my toes. Then she opened her mouth very wide and popped the big toe of my left foot into her mouth. When she opened her mouth, I had seen a double row of sharp teeth that promised to strip my flesh even as they bit through the bone. As the toe entered her mouth, I knew I would never see it again. When she sucked the toe instead, I thought maybe I'd been mistaken. Perhaps she was just playing with me. Maybe the alcohol had made me hallucinate, and this was nothing but a gin-soaked dream. Then she bit the toe, parting it from my body as she chewed with an ecstatic look on her cannibal's face. I cried out, but my cries mixed well with the dance's primal scream. No one would hear me out here anyway. We were miles from civilization. Even the fishermen on their boat that might be close would probably think I was a strange night bird. No one was coming to my rescue, and my body had betrayed me in the wake of the strange song. I was her plaything, her prisoner, and she could do with me as she liked. The other 4 toes of that foot went down simultaneously. She crunched them with relish, her serpentine tongue sliding out to lick the blood from her lips. When the toes were gone, she took a bite of the now oddly shaped foot. The blood ran darkly from the nub, and she lapped at it hungrily as she chewed. My throat felt raw from screaming, the pain intense and throbbing, and as she took a second bite, I heard my voice giving out from crying. She looked up at me, seductively enough to make certain parts of my body quiver, and began planting biting kisses up my leg. The wounds were red and oozing, her lips now painted in my blood, and as she bit her way up, I began to realize her destination. I tried to break free of her spell, not wanting to be parted from that particular portion of my body, but I was helpless before her. She kissed her way up my leg, her mouth splitting and the cheeks ripping at the corners as she prepared to bite through the front of my trousers. Then a dog howled somewhere in the jungle, and she cast her eyes fearfully towards it. She stared in the direction for nearly a minute, seeming unsure of herself. She was rattled. The dog's howl had put her off, just like the one on the mainland had. She stared out into the forest, eyes searching frantically. When nothing came running out of the jungle to challenge her, though, she turned back to her helplessly dancing victim. I'll save you the gory details. Needless to say, it was the worst pain of my life. I watched her throat bulge as she swallowed them down, a look of pure bliss on her face. My warm blood pattered down her placid face as she closed her eyes and basked in the taste of me. She looked up then, cat eyes searching, and I thought she might be seeing my heart as it beat in my chest. She licked the blood from her lips and stalked up my chest, grabbing my arms and holding them down fiercely, so my feebly swinging arms couldn't hinder her. Her mouth tore open at the corners again, and I closed my eyes against the oncoming rip of her 2 sharp teeth. The various wounds ached and bled, and at that moment I was almost glad that it was about to end. I just wanted the pain to stop. That's when I heard the howl, closer now than it had been, and something big slammed into her side. It knocked her off me, sending her squealing and hissing and driving her weight off of my hurting body. When I opened my eyes, I realized that it wasn't a dog at all. It was a wolf, a big black wolf with white snarling teeth and a pair of piss-yellow eyes that looked furious. My mind was a jumble. I didn't remember hearing about wolves in China, but I was far from upset by his sudden appearance. He leapt onto the woman and tore into her with his snarling maw. She hissed at him, slapping at him with her long nails, but as she showed some signs of driving him off, another wolf barreled from the jungle to join the first. As I lay bleeding, 8 of the largest wolves I had ever seen came snarling from the vegetation to ring her in. She looked at them. As her eyes met with mine, her face was full of fear. They buried her in a ring of ripping teeth and furry bodies. I didn't waste time. I dragged myself away from the clearing with what little strength I had left, making for the beach that had been so close when I had 2 whole feet. As I pulled myself away, I could hear them tearing and ripping at her screams driving into my brain like an ice pick. If you've never heard someone get mauled to death by a pack of wolves, consider yourself very lucky. I could hear them savaging her as I bled and crawled, and I had no illusions of getting far before they fell on me as well. I was leaving a clear enough blood trail and panting loud enough to be heard from the mainland. As the sounds of their feast became farther away, I began to think I might be allowed to die in the jungle instead of eaten alive by wolves. I had no hope of finding the beach again. I only knew that I didn't want to die as she had. When my fingers sank into the sand an undeterminable amount of time later, I drew them back in surprise. I had never expected to find the beach, and now that the sound of water engulfed me, I knew I might be allowed to die on the beach in relative comfort. I dug my body out onto that beach, my various injuries crying out as the sand caked them and was ground into them. I dragged myself forward until I could feel the shore's wet edge, and then rolled onto my back and lay where the water might slide up and touch me as I was dying. It was cold fire against my injured foot, but I didn't care. The sound of waves would be a perfect backdrop for my last few minutes on Earth. I could still feel the blood leaking out of my foot and crotch, and knew I had lost a lot of it. I closed my eyes and prepared to die, when my eyelids were suddenly blasted by a bright light. I thought it was the sun for one pain-soaked moment. I thought I had fallen into a pain-induced shock and come to the beach by day, but when the lights went away, I opened my eyes in confusion. The light returned a moment later, and I shaded my eyes to see it wasn't the sun, but a searchlight. As it slid away, I saw it was on a little ship that was cruising towards the coast. When I flopped back down and closed my eyes again, it fell on me and it held me in its regard. I heard people yelling, speaking in the native tongue, and there was a splash of boats being lowered into the water. I tried to struggle when they came for me, fearing that they were with her, but my body had reached its limits. I blacked out as the strong hands lifted me from the sand. The last thing I remember was feeling my back on the hardwood and wondering if it would be the last thing I ever felt. I woke up on the mainland, though. I had been asleep for 3 days. The doctors told me that some fishermen from the village had heard me screaming and come to see if they could help. My left foot was 60% gone. My left leg was in danger of needing amputation, since some of the bites had festered. My groin was a tube now. My reproductive organs were bitten off completely, and I was fortunate to be alive. Any longer, and you would have likely bled to death. As I lay in the clean white hospital room, being told I would likely lose my leg, and had lost the thing that at my age made me a man, I didn't feel so fortunate. The police came and asked me questions about what had happened, but you could tell they didn't believe me. The island I had been found on was private property, a nature preserve, and no one in the area ever went there for fear of the animals that lived there. They sounded like they thought I was a weirdo, some sex freak that had gone a little too far, and when I told them that the wolves had eaten the woman who had done this, they scoffed. If the fishermen in the village hadn't corroborated my story about leaving with a woman, they would have likely assumed I had done this to myself. I'd still be in the dark if the old man hadn't come to visit. He told me his name was Lee, and he had been one of the fishermen who had found me on the island. They had left the party after his brother had told them who I had gone off with. He said I was fortunate to be alive. Many people who ran across the Sheela were not so lucky. The what? I asked. Sheela. They are old creatures that live on the island. They are spirits, he said, trying to find the words to explain it. Not like our spirits, but still spirits. They come from the union of a spirit of air and a human. They feed on human flesh and love to entice their prey to a secluded area so they can extend their time with them. You said creature. You mean there are more of them? I asked, horrified. He nodded. We lose men to the island sometimes. Many villages do. Like you, some come back scarred and broken, saved by the wolves who hate the Sheela. You are very lucky, son. Never forget that. I lay back in bed, cold and wanting to throw up, thinking of others who had been lured to the island and devoured by that hateful thing. That was 2 weeks ago. The doctors say I will get to keep my leg, but there's nothing they can do about my situation below the belt. My company has offered to pay my hospital bills and sent over paperwork for a sizable settlement if I don't pursue any legal action for being hurt on the job. I told them I hadn't been injured on the job, but they don't seem to want to take any chances. The settlement will be more than enough to get home and start some semblance of a new life. I can't do what I used to do with one foot, so that part of my life is clearly behind me. So many things are behind me now. I tell my story not to elicit pity, but to warn those who might travel to this part of the world. Be careful who you follow home. That pretty face might hide some sharp teeth, and you might find yourself following your date back to her lair. There are Sheela out there still, and I can attest that their hunger and their cruelty are not like anything you've ever seen before. Be careful, and don't be her next victim.
First good rain of the season, it sounds like. Too bad it's going to waste with all that cold weather out there, but I don't know. Maybe it'll turn into some snow. We'll just have to see, won't we? This is always a weird story to tell because it's one that actually happened to yours truly. I've got a few of those weird, true-ish stories, but this one I actually lived through, so I hope you enjoy the strange occurrence that happened to me when I was not yet 20, when I saw the shadows on the wall. When I was a kid, I lived in a haunted house. I know how that sounds, and I don't want to sound pedantic, but I lived in an actual haunted house. It was never anything sinister throughout most of my childhood. You would see things out of the corner of your eye. You'd come downstairs and find things moved a little. My mom even had her hair pulled in the bathtub once, but it was an isolated incident that never happened again. Things moved downstairs, you'd hear weird noises, sometimes you'd hear voices, but it never went beyond that. It was annoying sometimes, but I never really felt threatened. It was just something that happened. Until my parents decided to sell the house. I was about 18 or 19 years old, and I'd just dropped out of college. Medical hadn't been for me, and I was just really burnt out and kind of lost. I had been writing since I was 8, but I hadn't discovered horror yet, and was still trying to hash out something in the fantasy trade. I had a job, and I had my parents' house to fall back on, at least until they informed me that they were moving 2 states away. They didn't have it all set up yet, but my parents were doing well enough that they could afford to go ahead and pick up another house to flip, while they were still trying to sell this one. They offered me a pretty sweet deal. Stay at the house and watch the dogs while they went and got the house ready to move. They'd be back in about 2 to 3 months after they had everything ready, and then they'd start moving everything up there officially. If they hadn't sold the house by then, I was more than welcome to stay and keep living in it for a while. This turned out to be moot since I didn't stay in the house longer than about a month. It started out with little things. Things were always going missing in the house. Car keys, coffee cups, and books, but now they were nowhere to be found. I lost my car keys 3 different times in that month, and each time I had to go to the dealership and get a new one made, to the tune of about $50. My school textbooks that I was getting ready to sell to a classmate also went missing, as did my Game Boy and a bill that I'd been planning on paying to keep myself out of debt. That's just the stuff I can remember, but it was a constant struggle, waking up and wondering what was going to be missing. The dogs also got very nervous in the house. My parents kept border collies, 2 of them, and they'd always been welcome in the house, along with the other menagerie of animals that my mother kept. They'd never been uncomfortable coming in and out before, but now they seemed to want to live on the back porch rather than in the house. The Florida heat is no joke, and when a dog with long hair would rather sleep in the non-air-conditioned back porch than inside, you know something's going on. I just chalked it up to them missing my parents, but I had no idea that it was about to start rattling up. That was about the time I started noticing the shadows. I slept upstairs more than downstairs, feeling safer upstairs, in case someone decided to break into the house. We had neighbors who were less than reputable, and our house had been broken into while we were on vacation before. I figured that if someone broke in, being upstairs would give me more time to get my gun ready and call the police. But the real problem was already inside the house. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, awoken by a sound or by a feeling, and see something moving in the room. Not really moving, I guess. I'd see the shadows on the wall as they walked behind me or around the bed. I'd turn my head to confront them, but there would never be anybody there. The room was always empty, and a search of the house would prove that no one was in there. What's more, even though they were on the back porch, I knew the dogs would pitch a fit if they smelled someone in the house. They might not have liked being in there, but they didn't like anybody being in there unless they knew them. I tried sleeping on the couch, but it was the same problem. I'd hear whispery voices, see big long shadows up the wall, and when I turned over to confront them, they'd be gone. Sometimes I'd hear things moving if I slept downstairs, so I always made a habit of sleeping upstairs. Most nights I tried to have friends over, people to watch movies with, or people to keep me company while I was at home. But most every night I wound up staying there by myself. I'd stay at friends' houses sometimes, but never for very long. I had responsibilities at home, and none of their parents were ready for a long-term house guest. I should have left after the shower incident, but I managed to talk myself out of it. I really wanted to believe I had just scratched myself on something. No one wants to believe their childhood house is actually haunted by hateful spirits. I was in the shower about 3 weeks after they left. I was getting ready for work, soap in my hair, soap in my eyes, when suddenly something scratched my shoulder. I opened my eyes and immediately regretted it, but I started looking around to see if one of the cats had scratched me, or if I had run up on a hook or something. Mom had little hooks on the wall for loofahs and things, but they had already been taken down. I didn't see any cats or anything in the bathroom, and I went back to cleaning the soap off myself before inspecting the scratch. It was from my shoulder blade to my mid-back, and it looked like 3 long scratches that looked a little infected. I put ointment on them and put a big Band-Aid over them. Mom was a nurse, and she had a lot of stuff like that in the craft room, and tried to ignore it. It was just an accident, after all. These things happened. So I fed the dogs and went to work, as I always had. When I got home that night, that's when the weirdness really hit a fever pitch. The second I came in the door, it was around midnight, I could swear I heard people upstairs. It sounded like 4 or 5 of them moving around on the 2nd story. I grabbed my dad's gun that he kept by the TV stand and headed upstairs to have a look. I hadn't seen any signs of a break-in, no broken windows or open doors, and I wondered how they'd gotten in without being seen. My parents had a big house, but most of the easiest ways to get in were through the living room. Unless these guys broke into a back room, I didn't figure they could have gotten in without me noticing. I came up the stairs, Beryl leading the way, but as I swooped into the big front room where my parents slept, there was no one there. I searched the house, upstairs and downstairs, but I found nothing. It was as if I had imagined the whole thing. The dogs sleeping peacefully on the back porch led me to believe that I was getting jumpy, and as I got ready for bed, I couldn't help but listen out to make sure that it wasn't just my nerves. That was when something kicked the door in, and I jumped about a foot. I was washing my face in the sink, and I winced as the soap came into my eyes again. I came downstairs several at a time, the gun back out front, to find the front door open, and no one there. I'd expected to hear footsteps as I came down the stairs, maybe even people running, but there was no one. It was an empty house with nothing in it. I made another pass at the house, but still found nothing. I was getting jumpy, really not liking what was going on here, and it was getting hard to get ready for bed. I brought the dogs back inside, little as they wanted to come in, and I tried to coax them upstairs so I could feel like I had a little company. I had known these dogs all their life. I helped my mom raise them from puppies, and it was the first time I had heard them growl at me as they stoically refused to go upstairs. They didn't snap, but I got the feeling that if I pressed the matter much, they might. I finally left them downstairs, deciding to close my bedroom door and get some rest. I put a chair under the front door as well. No sense waking up to it slamming open again if I could help it. I managed to get to sleep after some unsuccessful tossing, but when I did, it was short-lived. In my dreams, there were people standing around me, whispering. I didn't know who they were. They were people I'd never met, and when I rolled over to look at them, they had no faces. They were made of shadows, and I got the feeling they were talking about me. I can't explain why. There's no reason I have to feel that way. But suddenly, I knew that I was the subject of their conversation. I rolled over in my dream, not wanting to look at them, and that's when I saw the shadows riding up the wall. They danced and capered across the flat eggshell paint, and I realized I wasn't sleeping anymore. I could feel eyes on my back as I shivered under the covers, and the more awake I came, the more I realized I could still hear the whispered voices. These were the things that I'd been seeing when I tried to go to sleep every night, and as I came awake, I found that the shadows were still there. They were rising up the wall, 7 or 8 feet tall, and their legs stretched out behind them grotesquely. I don't know what they were saying, but I didn't like it. It was something like muttering, a constant flow of low talk, and when I turned to look at them, they didn't disappear this time. I couldn't see them, not really, no more than I believed they could see me, but I knew that they were looking at me. I was filled with the most profound terror I've ever experienced. I didn't know what to do. Did I stay? Did I go? This was my home. I had always felt welcome there, and this was the first time I had ever felt unease in the house. In the end, I chose not to confront them. I rolled out of bed as quick as I could and ran for the door. The dogs looked at me like I was crazy as I went downstairs, but I didn't really care. I was not staying in that house for another minute. I went to my car, opened the door, but remembered that I'd left my keys inside. I looked back at the house, but the thought of going back in there made my knees weak. There was no astral lights in the windows. There were no weird figures looking down at me. But suddenly looking at that dark house by night made me never want to go back in there again. I slept in my car till morning, and after the sun came up, I went to get my keys and a few things. I called a friend of mine and asked if I could spend the night at his place indefinitely, and after telling him what I had experienced, he agreed. I don't think he believed me, but I think he believed I'd seen something. His mom was the kind of person that believed in most anything, and when I told her, she insisted that I come stay. I stayed at his house until my parents sold the place, and then I went to live with my grandma until I got a place of my own. I thought I might be done with the weirdness in the house, but it had one last surprise for me. I went back a few weeks later to help them move some of their things onto the truck, and when we lifted the sectional, I found something I'd been looking for. Underneath the couch was everything I'd been missing, stacked in a neat pile and just waiting to be discovered. My dad laughed about it, saying I must be kind of scatterbrained, but I knew I'd checked under the couch many times. I helped them move their stuff on the truck, but insisted on being gone before dark. They thought I was being silly, but I never came back there again after dusk. When they sold the house a few months later, I got my stuff out and never came back. My mom got into ghost tours and things later in life, and did some research on the place after I told her about my experience. She was almost giddy when she told me about the checkered past of the house we'd lived in. Several people had died in that house, and not all of them of natural causes. There were rumors that 2 brothers had had a duel in the backyard, and one of them was still buried on the property. A boy drowned in the pond that sits at the corner of our land. Several people died of natural causes in the house, and whether or not they're the ones who haunt the house, I don't know. I find sometimes in my life that strange things seem to follow me. They seek me out sometimes, and I think that might have been part of the reason I started writing horror. The closer I get to understanding it, the more I know I'll understand my reasons behind it. And that's not the only strange thing that's ever happened to me. Perhaps I'll tell you about a few others sometime, if you like. Whew, Boy, a trip to this next locale seems like just the thing for me. I bet they don't have to deal with these kinds of torrential rains. So let's go in from shadows on the wall to shadows of the valley and see what it's like down there when we all go west for a little bit. Hey guys, it's me again, back with more of my travel diaries. I heard how much you guys liked my trip to Maine, so I figured I'd share my latest travels with you. I was in Arizona, taking in a local festival, when my editor asked me if I would investigate a mesa about 3 hours away. I wasn't really on board. I'd met someone at the festival and was looking forward to spending a couple of days with them. But when I saw the advance check that he sent along, I was excited to get underway. I know, but I have bills to pay too, and festivals come and go. So I hopped in my rental car and headed for the Lost Dutchman State Park near Phoenix. The state park is pretty interesting. Lots of red rocks and cacti. Kind of reminds me of the old westerns I used to watch with my grandpa. There's a lot of buttes, and you have to be careful about critters getting into your campsite, like most places in the desert. The instructions I was given were for a particular canyon with a name that was nearly unpronounceable to me. I have to type it out phonetically when I go to write the article, but the Native Americans who lived in the area called it Watcher's Ridge. Apparently, lots of campers in the area have reported seeing strange figures up on the ridge that surrounded the valley, and it was supposed to be pretty cool, if not a little spooky. I asked some of the park rangers about it, and they told me they had never seen anything like it, but maybe it was possible. You do see weird stuff out here from time to time, one of the old park rangers told me, and you do get kids who come out here to use drugs every now and again. Not that would change their experience. There are old places, and sometimes they're home to old things. Watch yourself out there, and make sure you're being safe. I asked him if he had any advice for capturing photos of the Watchers, and I wish I had listened to what he said. My advice is that I wouldn't. Things like that don't like being looked at for too long, and they certainly don't like having their picture taken. Do yourself a favor, young man. Take some pictures of the butte, do a little camping, see your Watchers, but only write about what you see. People go missing out there, and it could always be because they decided to take more than memories home with them. I drove the car down into the canyon, and by nightfall I had a fire pit dug and my tent pitched. I walked around a little as the afternoon grew shadows, taking pictures of wildlife and the gorgeous views. It was hard not to feel intimidated by the towering buttes that surrounded my campsite, and I took a lot of pictures. As the sun set, I made my way back to my tent and started making inroads on dinner. I sat by the fire a little while later and watched the sky come to life. It was a beautiful night, the stars spreading out before me like a tapestry, and I was feeling cozy as I sat beside my fire and took it all in. Still hadn't seen any Watchers, but the reports had said they didn't come out till later. It was early spring, and the next closest fire was a little dot on the horizon. It felt like I had the park to myself, and as I sat watching the stars, I thought that if the Watchers had this kind of view every night, then it was no wonder they stayed. Speaking of Watchers, I kept an eye out for them as the night grew late, but I didn't see any. I had made sure to put myself amidst the 3 buttes, the best place to see one, or so the account said, and while they were quite imposing, I had yet to glimpse one of these mysterious figures. I reached for my phone and opened the email I'd gotten, looking over the accounts that my editor had sent me. There were 3, one from a solo hiker, one from a couple on a camping trip, and one from a group of college students who had come out here to party. The solo hiker, who called himself Frank, talked about stopping for the night in the valley and seeing the figures on the cliffside. He'd been camping in the valley where I was now, just his sleeping bag and the stars, when he'd noticed some weird shapes on the rock wall. They were vaguely humanoid, or at least human-shaped, and had been watching him intently. He couldn't tell much about them, but they had looked like shadows that had been cast up on the rock wall. He had ignored them, and they had watched him right back. When he'd woken up the next day, they were gone. The couple had said much the same, except that when her husband had flashed his lantern at them, more had appeared on the adjoining butte. Her husband had thought it was funny then and kept flashing the lantern at them, till the whole ledge was ringed in shadow figures. His wife had begged him to stop before it went that far, and as they sat in the canyon and watched the gathering shadows look down on them, the mood had begun to shift. Suddenly, it wasn't quite so much fun with all those ominous eyes on them, and the couple had packed up in a hurry and stayed at a Howard Johnson that night. I looked up before reading the last one, checking to see if they had come while I was doing research. No such luck, though. The third account was by far the strangest. A bunch of college kids from the University of Arizona had come out to camp for the weekend and pursue academic matters in the desert. And by that, I mean they came out to drink beer, bother people who had come for a quiet weekend, and generally be a nuisance for the Park Service. They had set up about 5 tents, 2 barbecues, and tried to set up a volleyball net before the Park Service stopped them. They had requested the space for the weekend, but they'd only lasted until the wee hours of Saturday morning. There were 4 different accounts, but they all boiled down to one story. The 12 of them had started drinking before the sun went down, and 5 or 6 of them were still drinking at about 2 in the morning. They'd built a large fire, something they probably weren't supposed to do, and were sitting around it and telling stories or anecdotes or whatever. They were 3 sheets to the wind, and that was when one of the guys had said they should tell some ghost stories. No one seemed to remember who had suggested it, but Parker was telling a story about a shadow figure who had dogged his heels one night when he went back to his dorm. One of the girls noticed the figures on the ridge about that point. The boys had started out puffing their chests and saying they better stay away from their girls or they would mess them up. But as the figures stayed up there, the group started to get curious. They claimed there were 2 at the start, but as they watched them, they noticed 2 more farther down. One of them thought they had binoculars in their pack, but as they used them to look at the assembled figures, something changed. The figures started getting angry then, their shadowy forms moving fitfully as the 4 became 8, became 16. The report claimed they had started coming down the butte, just descending like ants out of the hill, and the drunk kids had decided to put out their fire and get in their tent. All 6 had piled into the same tent, waking up the 2 people already inside, and they said that all at once it was like something was shaking and pushing the other side of the tent. They could hear people yelling from the other tents, but if anyone went outside, they never said. This went on for about 5 to 10 minutes before it stopped, as quickly as it had begun. All 12 of the kids had went to check on the campsite, and they said it looked like an army had ransacked it. Grills were trampled, coolers reduced to foam pulp, and the chairs they had been sitting in around the fire were metal and cloth hulks. The kids hadn't even bothered to clean up. They had gotten in their vehicles and left, leaving their campsite behind. They had called this report into the Forestry Service, refusing to come and clean up their campsite, and were likely on some kind of list now. They would have to choose some other national park to trash in the future, I thought, as I stifled a yawn and reached for my paperback. I looked back up at the buttes and hoped they wouldn't make me wait all night. I yawned again as I found my spot in my much-loved copy of Clash of Kings and settled in to wait. The longer I read, the more the words began to run together, and it wasn't too long before the book lay across my chest, and I was snoring beside the small fire. My head had propped up against my rucksack. The fire was low, thankfully, and nothing came up to inspect me. Nothing with sharp teeth or a rumbling belly, at least. The night went on around me, the moon sliding across the sky, and if the watchers on the butte saw me, they didn't say anything. Not yet, anyway. I slept till around 1, and when I jerked awake, I was aware of little beyond how low the fire had become and how late it had gotten. I cursed, closing my book and stuffing it back into my rucksack as I sat up and rubbed my face. It couldn't be helped, of course. I had driven all day and set up a campsite and then tried to stay up all night. Something would have to give, and I suppose my body would need to recharge at some time. I had turned to get my rucksack so I could take it back into the tent with me when I saw something on the lip of the butte behind me. It was a smudge, more like the idea of a shadow, But the longer I looked, the more I saw something hunkered up there. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in an ethereal light, and as I glanced along the butte, I became aware that I was surrounded. The ledge was full of shadowy figures, and as they goggled down at me, I reached for my camera. They hadn't liked it when someone had looked at them through the binoculars, but I needed a shot for the article. I lifted the camera, zooming in a little as I tried to get as many in frame as possible, but I had been careless. When I clicked the button, the flash went off, and in the dim light, it seemed like a miniature sun. I could see them through the little window, the zoom pretty good on my camera, and the way the kids had described them hadn't done them justice. They boiled down the side of the butte like lava from a volcano, and I grabbed my pack as I made a run for the truck. I tossed the pack in, climbing behind the wheel as I keyed the engine and peeled out of the campsite. It took me close to a mile to realize that I still had my camera in my hand, and it took everything I had not to toss it roughly into the back seat. I needed those pictures, but I needed to be alive to turn them into my editor and get paid. The moon was pretty full, as I said, and it cast the flatlands below the buttes in stark light. I could see them roll over my campsite, and as they came after my car, I continued to floor it. They were fast, but after a mile or two, I stopped seeing them. By the time I got to the lodge on the edge of the camping area, they were gone. But I still kept driving till I made it to the visitor center near the entrance to the park. I slept in the back seat with the doors locked until the sun came up. And then I went back to clean up my campsite. I was a little braver than a bunch of kids, at least when the sun was up. My campsite was destroyed. The tent was wrecked, pulled up and shoved about 20 feet from where I'd staked it. The campfire looked like a marathon had run over it. The little camp stove I'd brought was equally flattened, and I was pretty glad I'd remembered to grab my backpack. I took some pictures of the campsite, too. Might as well give the reader the full picture of what they might be encountering. I cleaned up the mess, piling it in the back of my rental car, and dumped it all into the dumpster near the ranger station. "Looks like you got more than photos," came a voice from behind me. I turned to find the ranger from the other day, his arms crossed as he leaned against the side of the bus shed that sat near the dumpster. He didn't look mad, more bemused than anything, and I couldn't help but chuckle a little as I nodded. He was right. I hadn't listened, and I had paid the price. "Yeah, guess I should have listened." He shrugged. I didn't figure you would. Some people just have to go looking for things, and they need proof to take back. Just glad you made it out in one piece." I asked him what he meant, and he glanced behind him before stepping in closer. He clearly didn't want to be heard. "I didn't lie yesterday. I've never seen anything like what you're talking about. That being said, we do find abandoned campsites from time to time. It's usually people just camping in their sleeping bags under the stars, the ones who don't have access to a tent. Even a simple door seems to keep them out, but that won't stop them from pushing it. We had a fella in his RV pushed over a few years back, and we had to get a tow truck out there to pick it up. His kids had been stargazing and must have noticed that they had an audience. We started telling people to be careful, but we haven't had a disappearance since last year, and I didn't think they would bother you. Guess I was wrong. I got a hotel not too far off to finish my article. The lodge is rustic, but it still has HBO and a whirlpool tub in the suite. The article's coming along nicely, but the memories of that night in the valley may take a little bit longer to be finished with me. Stay tuned for more of my travel articles. I'm sure I'll take you with me again sometime. It's always funny when the rain comes down the chimney a bit, and you can hear the fire popping under that barricade of little raindrops that keep falling down the chimney. Sometimes the spooky things we see at night are best forgotten about, if best not seen at all. Case in point, let's move on to our next gruesome tale about someone who thankfully didn't see as much as his significant other did. So let's have a listen to Saw.
"Hey, you awake?" I pretended to be asleep, but she knew I wasn't. She jabbed me with her toe, and
I put on some big fake snores as I played it up and hoped she'd forget what she wanted me to do. She was always doing this sort of thing, waking me up and asking me to do something in the middle of the night. With work less than 7 hours of blissful sleep away, though, I wanted to roll over and get back to it pretty badly. As the jabbing toe came again, I finally sighed and rolled over to face her. Not anymore, I guess. Good. Then you can take that trash out, right? I wrinkled my nose at her. The trash? Really? It's 1 a.m, Margaret. She wrinkled her own nose, knowing I only used her full name when I was put out with her. Yeah, and I've lain here and smelled that fish you put in the can for the last 3 hours. Please, for me. I rolled away from her and burrowed down into the covers. Why don't you do it if it's such a problem? Her voice was serious when she answered. You know I don't go out after dark. Remember, I told you that because your mom died. Yeah, I remember. Look, can't I just do it in the morning? It's really late, and the prodding toe became a foot that playfully rolled me out of bed. No, please, check on Emma while you're up, too. I sighed and walked up the hall to the kitchen, pausing to look into the nursery. Emma was snoring away happily from her crib, and I cracked the door and went into the kitchen. Maggie was right. The fish was ripe, and I lifted the shiny black bag out of the can and took it out the front door. I walked around the usual pitfalls that awaited me in the dark room. Toys, the footstool, clothes left for tomorrow's cleaning, and opened the front door to step outside. The air outside was thick, heavy with the smell of rain, and I just knew that it would take hours to get back to sleep after being buffeted by the aromatic wind. It wasn't until the front porch's worn boards greeted me that I realized the world looked a little strange. The walls were bent and wobbly, the colors slightly runny, and that's when I realized I'd forgotten my glasses. Now, I'm not blind by any stretch. I could navigate pretty well without them, but it was a pain to be out at night without them. I went down the porch steps, found the can, and dropped the bag in with a sudden clatter of cans, bottles, and other kitchen trash. The sound echoed across the still night like a cannon shot, and I was grateful that we didn't have any neighbors to bother. I felt for the banister rail and caught hold of the smooth wood as I mounted the stairs. That was when I heard a noise to my left. Maggie and I own land out in the country, and the woods that butt up against our property are rotten with coyotes, foxes, and the occasional raccoon or possum. This sound, however, was closer than I thought it should be, and as I looked up, I saw something gray moving out of the dog pen. Bosco, our husky lab mix, can usually be counted on to bark if he sees something weird, but as the shape glided towards the house, I remember wondering why he didn't make a sound. Watching the thing move filled me with a surge of terror and apprehension. Even without my glasses, its shape was wrong. It was long, not tall, thick, but not muscular, and it almost seemed to glide up the steps on the opposite end of the porch, as if floating. I was dazed. My senses turned up to 11, and the hairs on my body were standing on end as I stood frozen at the bottom of the steps, watching this thing open the front door before slamming it roughly behind it. That galvanized me. I was in motion before my lizard brain could think better of it. I sprinted up the stairs, through the screen door, and tripped hard against the patio furniture as I stumbled into the door. I pulled at the handle, but it was useless. Reaching to my side for keys, I found that I didn't have any, because I was absent pockets on my pajama pants. Ditto my cell phone, so my only course to warn Maggie seemed to be the old-fashioned way. I ran around the house, but found the bedroom window just out of reach. I found a cinder block, though, and sat it against the house's side as I tried to knock on the window and warn her. I raised my fist to hit the glass just as I heard the door to the bedroom open. I heard her sleepy voice say something about that didn't take too long, now did it? Heard the bed covers rustle as she sat up, and heard her scream as something made a sound between a cat and a flute. The cinder block smashed through the front door glass with an awful crash, and my bare feet sounded like cannon shots as they came slamming up the hallway on my way to the bedroom. I wrapped my hands around the doorknob, but before I could twist it, I heard the window break, and I knew I was too late. She waited for me inside, though, at least what was left of her. The police told me it looked like an animal attack. Her throat had been bitten out. Her eyes had been removed. Her body looked like someone had tried to bite her as many times as possible. Bosco had been its first victim. His neck snapped with a single twist, and Emma and I seemed to be the only ones immune to its wrath. The paramedics took her away, wrapped in the black bag they used to spare the living, as my sleeping daughter and I stood on the very porch I had just watched the creature glide onto. I sold the house after that. I no longer felt safe within the walls of that home, and the memory of that creature was too fresh for me to ever feel safe there again. Emma and I moved into an apartment in the city. I found a place so full of noise and people that I doubted whatever it was could even live there. I still have trouble sleeping. Every time I close my eyes, I dream about that abnormal shape that glided into my house and murdered my wife as she sat in her bed. Whether my Maggie knew it or not, she saved me that night. The message scrawled in her blood above the headboard was very clear on that, and me forgetting my glasses was probably the only reason I'm still alive. Maggie had always claimed that she saw her mother's killer. She told her therapist that it was a monster, something she had seen when she was a child, a demon, and when she was an adult, she had held firm to the idea that it wasn't human when she talked about it. Her mother had been on the porch with Maggie, looking out into the field behind their house, when she had suddenly put her little girl inside and locked the door. Maggie didn't see it at all, only some of it through the blurry window, but she must have seen something. That's why she had to die. The message was very clear. Scrawled in my wife's blood across the top of the headboard were 4 words that will haunt me until the day I die. Because she saw. One more story for you, and then I think it's going to be time for me to go see about a nap. This next story is about a trucker. Some of you, I'm sure, can understand his line of work. Maybe there's some of you listening to these stories from the road right now. But let's hope if you are, you don't get a look at what he saw while he was driving. So let's hear a little about the reflections from the highway.
Driving is easily the most boring part of my job. I work as a salesman for an all-in-one printer company. Business has been slow the last couple of years with the rise of personal printers, but our loyal customer base has really helped us get through these troubling times. That's why I was in Garrison and Marco's attorney at law that day. I'd been trying to sell them on the latest color all-in-one model to replace their current one, which was a few years old. They had sent me back to the office with a "we'll think about it," and I had started my 4-hour drive back to said office. That's how I came to be on the highway behind the truck in the first place. The sun was setting when I left the law firm. By the time I got on the highway, it was already dark. I mingled with the other cars as we merged in with the big rigs that made the interstate their home. I was behind a particularly large 18-wheeler when I first noticed the thing. It started out as a reflection. Have you ever noticed how an animal's eyes will reflect the light? Well, it was like that. I was sitting behind him with my low beams on when I noticed the sparkle from underneath the trailer. It was 3 or 4 small reflective points, and in my mind, I sort of obsessed over it. What could possibly be making those reflections? Some sort of axle? Maybe something ornamental that the driver had stuck under this truck. It probably seems silly to obsess over something like that as you sit reading my story. But when you're stuck in traffic on the interstate, your mind searches for all sorts of things to occupy your time. Whatever it was midway between the front wheels and the back wheels, too far into the truck for me to really make it out. I didn't think it was alive or anything, but it was a fun little mystery. I was stuck in gridlock. Some wreck up the way had brought us to a halt, and as I adjusted the radio in the beat-up old car that gave the salesman a drive, I found my eyes returning to that thing again and again. My brain just wouldn't leave it alone, and I began to create reasons for the thing to be under there. Maybe it was for stability. Maybe it was something he had put under there so people didn't hit the back of the trailer in the middle of the night. Maybe it was just one of those stupid things that people often hook to their trucks just because they can. Whatever it was, my mind had decided to obsess over it. I was watching it when my cell phone rang, and as I fished it out of my pocket, I found my eyes rising to see the thing as I said hello. So,
Can we go ahead and put them down for a new printer? The boss asked. They said they'd have to think about it, but they also said there's nothing wrong with their current printer, so I wouldn't expect to see any orders from them. Damn, I was really counting on offloading a couple of these to the firm. Did you tell them about the added features? Of course I did, sir. And I was about to tell him that I was no rookie salesman when I looked up and almost dropped the phone. The thing I had been focused on for the last 20 miles had moved. It was subtle, but when you've been staring at it for as long as I had, you notice these things. The thin fiber filament had shifted somehow, and the pattern had changed. I was almost sure of it. I could hear my boss asking if I was still there, and I assured him that I was. I told him I would be back in the office in a few hours, and he told me just to head home. I could turn in my reports tomorrow. Sounds like you could use the sleep. You're sounding a little jittery. I thanked him and told him I'd see him tomorrow, before hanging up the phone and looking back at the thing under the truck. I could also see 6 surfaces reflected back at me now, instead of the 4 I had seen a moment ago. They looked even more like eyes. Whatever wreck there was up ahead, they must have cleared it out of the way. We were suddenly moving along again at a brisk pace, and I was glad for the shift in speed. My mind had suddenly turned what looked like some kind of ornament into something dangerous, and I really wanted to be from behind this truck. There was no chance of getting around them, though. The traffic was still pretty tight, and I was pretty well trapped behind this 18-wheeler and the 18-wheeler beside me. So for the next 2 hours we drove, the most nerve-wracking 2 hours of my life. The longer we drove, the more I was convinced that it was no optical illusion. Whatever was under there was definitely moving, and it had quite a few legs that I could see. It was using 2 of the thinner ones to hold itself under the truck, and the other 6 or 8, or maybe even as many as 10, were anchoring it to the truck itself. What was worse were all those reflective surfaces that I still thought of as eyes. They were staring straight at me the whole time, and I began to believe that it knew I could see it. I shook my head the first time I thought this. I was tired, I had had too much coffee, and I was just seeing things. These were the excuses that ran around and around inside my head, like a dog chasing his tail. I didn't want to believe that I was stuck behind a truck, carrying a very different sort of cargo. I wanted to believe that I was just seeing things, and I was making things up to pass the time. That sort of delusion only lasted until the thing moved closer. You see, the longer I watched it, the longer it watched me. I don't know if it knew I could see it, but it didn't seem to like the level of scrutiny I was giving it. It was midway between the cab, watching me like a predator watching its prey. The longer it went on, the less safe I felt inside my car. Something that big could surely get through the window, or break the windshield, and I would have nowhere to go in this gridlock. But I was still trying to be rational, trying to be realistic. There was no way that whatever it was alive. It was a trick of the light. It was my mind playing tricks on me. When I finally got home, safe behind the door of my apartment, I would laugh about how silly I had been, and feel really stupid. I was a grown man behind the wheel of a car, jumping at shadows. I began to use this idea as a security blanket, wrapping myself in it so I didn't just go crazy right there behind the wheel of my car. That was when it moved. The reflective eyes shifted suddenly. I don't mean that they blinked or anything. I mean they shifted. One minute I was looking at it, and the next it was sliding beneath the underside of the trailer. Suddenly those eyes were coming closer. They were less than 10 feet away from my car now, peering from under the trailer at me as I tried to maintain my speed. I know how that sounds, but it's the truth. Whatever it was had finally gotten tired of being watched, and had decided to get closer. I felt a sudden stirring of primal fear. This must have been how early man had felt when it encountered something it just didn't understand. When it saw the long teeth and heard the growl of some unknown predator. When it saw the all-too-intelligent eyes of an animal that was a little too human reflected in the darkness. When it came to realize that the safety of its cave could also be a trap. I imagine that it felt just as helpless as I did now. Helpless, but intent on survival. I tried again to convince myself that I was being silly. This was nothing more than a trick of the light, some errant spiderweb under the cab that my headlights were catching that just now came loose, and was presenting itself as some sort of boogeyman for me to be afraid of. I suddenly knew how to alleviate this fear. I would flip my high beams on. The high beams would show me the underside of the truck, and I could see that the source of my fears was nothing at all. I reached for the switch, my hands much less steady than I thought they should be, my fingers wrapping around the knob. For a moment, I just couldn't bring myself to turn the switch. Did I really want to know? Did I really want this thing to know that I knew? Once the monster in the closet knows that you know it's there, does it have any choice but to eat you? I shook my head and flipped the switch on. I know now that I shouldn't have done that. What was under the cab was no spider web, but it was the monster I had feared it was. It was a spider the size of a large dog. It was easily 4.5 feet tall, and it was hunkered beneath the trailer's cluster of wheels. It looked at me upside down, with its legs clinging to the metal, its fangs dripping some translucent liquid and clicking together very fast. It made a high, angry sound that I could hear from behind my closed windows, and the look it gave me on its far too expressive face was terrifying. My brain seemed to give me a choice between fight or flight, and in my cowardice, I chose flight. I pulled around the truck, pulling onto the soft shoulder of the road, and drove around it and the line of angry cars. Fortunately, there were no police officers in that line. There was an exit ramp not too terribly far from the truck, and I whipped into the on-ramp and pulled away from the highway into the small gas station about a mile later. It took me nearly 30 minutes to make my breath regular, expecting that spider creature to attack my car any minute. When I had control of myself again, I drove home. It took an extra hour, but I took side roads and back ways the whole way. So often in these stories, there's a moment of horror that comes afterward. Some accident, a truck found abandoned on the side of the road, a dead body in the truck stop, but there was none of that for me. I never heard a news report alluding to anything strange or out of the ordinary. I could almost forget about it until I close my eyes and see those far too expressive eyes looking at me as the high beams pin it to the underside and their lights. I take back roads whenever I travel now, avoiding the highway at all costs. I avoid big rigs as well. I don't ever want to see anything like that again. And just like that, it appears that today's stories are over. But don't be too sad. I'll be back again some other time with some more great tales and some more great times. Till then, this is Dr. Plague wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.